What it do, U.S. history students? So, for today's at-home assignment, we're going to talk about the causes of secession, not succession, secession in the Civil War. And then at the end, or probably when we come back into class, we're going to try to think about how would we organize those into long-term, short-term, and more immediate causes. Because usually, when you're analyzing a causal chain or cause and effect in history, you want to try to think about how you would categorize those. So you're going to need that note sheet. If you don't have it ready to go, it's an outline. It's a guided outline that gives you the information that you need from the slides to make sure you have the pertinent information. And it's broken up into the 6 big events that we're going to talk about in chronological. Well, there's one that's a little bit out of order, but in general chronological order as we go. So the first one is actually not on the note sheet, but it's important for understanding because we didn't talk a lot about it in the Unit 2 expansion unit, and that is the Missouri Compromise in 1820. So sectional tension between especially the North and the South was revealed in 1819 when a territory called Missouri, or Missouri, depending on where you're from, was asking Congress for statehood. And they wanted to become a state, and the big question was going to be, were they going to be a slave state or a free state? Because at that point in time, the slave states and free states were pretty much balanced in the Senate. So you had 2 senators from each state, and the number of slave state senators and free state senators were equal. So it was going to throw off the balance if you introduce a new state either way. You don't need to memorize this part, but the Talmadge Amendment was this idea that no slaves could be brought to Missouri, and then also there would be gradual emancipation of children born to slave parents that were already there, and there was this big outburst amongst Southerners and slaveholders that didn't like this, and they thought it was a threat to the sectional balance. So none other than our good friend Henry Clay, the Whig, he's still in Congress, holding on, comes up and he says that he proposes a compromise that ends up being called the Missouri Compromise, which is that Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, but at the same time, they were going to carve off this little chunk of Massachusetts, which was way up in the north. It was northern property of Massachusetts, and they were going to call it Maine, and that it would become a free state. And therefore, you would have one new free state and one new slave state, and the balance would be maintained. Now, that's good because that settles the short-term issue, but what's a little bit more important for the issues of the Civil War is that it set out the rule that all future states would prohibit slavery north of basically 3630, which is the southern boundary of Missouri. So any new states that are south of the southernmost boundary of Missouri would be slave states, and any new states that were north of that would be free states. So seems pretty easy, pretty objective. Here's the map right here that shows you the line. The line's going to be right, well, here's where they're showing it, but basically right here where, whoops, I'm erasing. Right there, so south of Missouri. So from then on, anything that hits south of Missouri as you go out into the west is going to be slave, and anything north is going to be free. So it seems like it's pretty understood. There's Maine up there. If you've never been there, I lived there for a little while, but a little part of Massachusetts. So that's all fine and dandy until you get to 1848, which I'm going to go through kind of quickly because we already learned about this with the Mexican-American War. But in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the U.S. gets a huge chunk of land, parts of Texas, areas stretching into California, the southwest of the United States. And you have this big question, which is, will this new territory be open for slavery? Because during this time, it was only supposed to be territory that was already in the United States. The Missouri Compromise didn't actually cover new territory. And even if it did, you have California, which is in both parts of the Missouri Compromise. So that's going to cause problems as well. So there's this big fight, especially in the Senate, about what's going to happen to this new territory. So once again, going out, if you look solely at having just the Missouri Compromise, you're going to run into a whole bunch of issues with some states kind of going in between. But again, the Missouri Compromise was only supposed to be for areas out here, okay, areas that were part of the United States at that time. But anyway. So the big first event that you have is the Compromise of 1850, and they call it that because it happened in 1850. And who came up with this? You better believe it, Henry Clay, once again, the great compromiser. So you got the Mexican cession. What are you going to do about slavery? So Henry Clay bangs out another compromise with this guy, Stephen Douglas. He should only have one S in his name. That's not good. Sorry, he's not Frederick Douglass. So he steers the bill through Congress, and here's the deal. So Texas surrendered its claims to New Mexico. That's not really that important. I wouldn't really freak out about this, okay? But California becomes a free state, so a very massive free state is added to the Union. New Mexico and Utah get to decide based on popular sovereignty. And that's going to come up a lot. This was one of the principles of the Constitution, if you remember, way back a couple weeks ago. Popular sovereignty. So basically, you've got this issue where the people get to decide, or they will vote on whether it will be slave or free. So popular sovereignty is going to come back again. And then, now, so far, these first two things, New Mexico and Utah, everybody probably figured that they're going to vote to be slave states. California becomes a free state. Not a whole lot directly given to the South at this point. So to help the South out as part of the compromise, there's a new fugitive slave law that becomes important. So it strengthens an old fugitive slave law, but the big thing about it is that now citizens can be forced to aid in the capture of runaway slaves. Like, you can't just look the other way if you know that there's a runaway slave. You have to report it, and also you can be commissioned by slave catchers to be part of what was called the posse, to go out and try to go find slaves. Also made it much easier to return runaway slaves. Citizens were punished if they aided runaway slaves. Also, judges, if you found someone that you thought was a runaway slave, they would go before a judge, and the judge, it was something, I can't remember the exact numbers, but they would get paid something like $5 if they determined the person was a free person, and then like $10 if they returned a slave. So there was like this financial incentive to determine that people were slaves. Didn't really make it very fair. And then the last thing that was supposed to be kind of for the Northerners in this deal was that the slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C. It wasn't, slavery was okay to have. You could have slaves in Washington, you know, the home of American government, but you couldn't trade slaves in Washington, D.C. So there's a variety of different things, and it's not so much just memorizing all of these. I think it's important to know the fugitive slave law and that California became a free state. But the big effects that you need to know is that it does postpone war for 10 years because people were already talking about secession and going to war in 1850. But it also has this effect of polarizing the South and the North. And polarizing like a magnet with the North and South pole, it kind of tends to bring people, push people apart. So if you remember, like, politically, for a long time, the Democrats had agreed not to really talk about slavery, and that allowed them to have Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats that could most of the time get along. But now you're starting to get these political parties that are pushing based off of regional aspirations, so North versus South. So that's a key political development, but it comes out of something that was supposed to be a compromise. So compromise of 1850. Number two, I always feel like I do a terrible job of explaining no matter what happens. I don't know why, but I will put there's a video clip, and I will put that, like, the slideshow in Teams so you can go back and look at it if you'd like to. It explains in a lot more depth if you want to see it. But here's the background, okay? If you look at a map, just above Missouri, you have Kansas and Nebraska, or near Missouri, I should say. Here are the rules, though. The rules had yet to be set for territorial governments in Kansas and Nebraska about whether or not they would be slave or free, or how they would be brought into the Union. And at the same time, these are two things that seem unrelated, but at the same time, there was a bunch of railroad companies that really wanted to buy up some federal land out in this territory over here to build railroads to go across the continent, transcontinental railroad. And they wanted to go from the Midwest and use Kansas and Nebraska as a place to build that railroad. So in order to do that, though, they needed the territory to be more organized. So they preferably would want to have the territory be developed into being a state at that time, but not necessarily. So you have this issue of this undeveloped territory out, again, Kansas, Nebraska, and you want to build a railroad to go across. And especially important, again, he shouldn't have two S's. Especially important was Stephen Douglas, a Democrat from Illinois. And his big thing is he wants the trailhead or the railhead to go through Chicago because that's his home state, big city in his home state. He wants more economic He wants Chicago to be more of an economic center. It's right on Lake Michigan. It's good for transportation, especially with those clipper ships. So he really wants to find a way to make a bill that he can get enough support to get that railroad to go across the continent and into Chicago. And he needs to work with Southerners in his party in order to do this. But he knows that if they follow the Missouri Compromise, the Southerners in the Congress are not going to go along with this plan because it will, in effect, create 2 more new free states. So he's trying to think to himself, how can I get Southerners to support this plan and get my railroad, but also not go against the Missouri Compromise? And he comes up with this sort of ingenious idea, and he says, hey, look, what we should do is instead of following the Missouri Compromise to the letter, let's change our plan a little bit and go back to that idea from the Compromise of 1850 where we have popular sovereignty. So we'll just let the people in Kansas and Nebraska vote on whether or not they will be slave or free. Now, the original idea here was that Kansas would just vote to be slave and Nebraska would vote to be free, and there wouldn't be a problem, but actually doesn't go that way. So what this does is it undoes the Missouri Compromise. It basically says, nope, the Missouri Compromise doesn't apply anymore, and now we don't have a general rule for accepting new states. And not only that, but you have a whole bunch of people that feel like they have a duty or an obligation to affect the outcome of the election. So all these people are moving from the north to Kansas, and people are moving from the south into Kansas, and you have a whole lot of bloodshed, which leads to this thing called Bleeding Kansas, where a lot of people say that the Civil War actually started in Kansas in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because people are literally fighting each other in the streets about voting and whether or not Kansas should be a free or a slave state. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is a key development because it not only undoes the Missouri Compromise for future states, but leads to actual violence between Northerners and Southerners that are either opposed or very, very intensely supportive of slavery. Also, the Republican Party forms an opposition, which we will get to in a second. Again, if you want more explanation, I'm happy to explain it more in class, but there's also this video clip down here that you can watch that explains what was happening in more detail. Oh, there's Stephen Douglas. He was like 5'3". They called him a little giant. He was a big deal. In 1857, event number 3 was called Dred Scott v. Sanford, also known as the Dred Scott decision, 1857. So here's a little bit of background. Dred Scott was this guy over here. He was an enslaved African who actually, with the help of some anti-slavery societies, because he couldn't really do this on his own, with the help of some anti-slavery societies, he sued for his freedom in court, just like a lot of enslaved Africans did early on in slavery. But he sued for his freedom in court with the argument that he had lived in places where slavery were outlawed. So he had, I forget the whole exact story, for which I apologize, but I believe what happened was that his master died, and he got a new master, and then that master brought him to Wisconsin, amongst other places up in the Northwest Territory, and that because he had lived in free states for a while, he should then be freed as a slave because slavery was outlawed in those territories. So it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Robert Taney, that's how you say his name, it looks like Taney, but it was Taney, delivered the majority opinion, and it was 7-2. So this was not even very close. Okay, and this is a really key. This is an opinion that had a couple different parts to it, but it was very key in the development of understanding the legality of slavery in the United States. So the first thing he said was any person, slave or free, that is descended from Africans is not a citizen of the United States. Okay, so first off, you are not a citizen if you are of African descent in the United States. You do not have the rights of a citizen. So therefore, Dred Scott shouldn't even be there suing for his freedom in the first place because he's not a citizen. Secondly, slaves are private property. And he goes back to the Bill of Rights that was supposed to protect individual liberties. And he says, since the Bill of Rights has due process and the Fifth Amendment, that means that Congress does not have the authority to take your property without due process. Therefore, the Missouri Compromise and anything else like it is unconstitutional. So basically, anything that the federal government does that tries to ban or stop slavery is unconstitutional and should not be in effect. And then he finally said, even though states could pass laws to limit slavery, so individual states could, the federal government could not. So basically, he's taking the power away from the federal government to enforce slave laws or develop laws against slavery, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, because the original judicial review issue was John Marshall, which gave a whole bunch of power to the federal government. And now Chief Justice Taney is like using judicial review to take power away from the federal government. So there's a lot of reactions here because people are upset because they feel like now the federal government is supposed to not be doing anything. And what happens if the federal government decides to just ignore this? Like Andrew Jackson ignored the ruling about the Indian Removal Act and just keep making laws that affect slavery. What are they going to do then? So you got these reactions where in the North you have a lot of shock, fear, and anger. One little caveat here is that the shock, fear, and anger is more about the threat to the free labor system than sorrow over African American rights being eliminated. So people are more concerned about slavery spreading to more territories, not rather than being upset about human rights violations. And in the South, they feel very satisfied and emboldened. And some people are saying that soon we'll see slave auctions in Boston Common up in Massachusetts, that slavery is going to be revitalized across the nation as a result of this. So they're very emboldened, and they're also becoming very suspicious of any federal dealings with slavery at this time in 1857. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now we're a few years after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Bleeding Kansas is still going on, but now we have a ruling from the Supreme Court. So I'd like you to take a couple minutes, and you can talk to your group members if they're on right now, or if you're watching this together, like a watch party or something. But I would like you to just do a quick summary of the first three events. So I have this thesis statement here, which is national leaders made a variety of proposals to resolve the issue of slavery in the territories, but these ultimately failed to reduce sectional conflict. So what I'd like you to do is, using the notes you've taken on these three events, give me two pieces of evidence that support this thesis, that leaders were trying to actually reduce the issue of slavery, but it actually ended up backfiring and becoming worse for them. So explain how it ties back to the thesis. Don't just list Kansas-Nebraska Act. That doesn't help you. So explain like how it supports the idea of things going wrong for national leaders. So pause me for a while and take some time to do that. Okay, part two. So moving on a little bit, getting a little more political here. So I'm going a little bit back in time because this is 1854, not 1857, but it comes after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So you have the beginning of the Republican Party. So the Republican Party's initial slogan was free labor, free land, free men, and then Fremont, who is their first presidential candidate, who was he was really popular in the Mexican-American War as a general, and then he becomes the first Republican nominee for president. Doesn't win, though, but he becomes the first one. They form in this little town that I've been to before called Ripon, Wisconsin, and it used to be the home of Ripon Good Cookies, which made amazing macaroons, just so you know. I'll try to get you some if I can. Just ask. But it was kind of this mishmash of different parties and different groups. So the first group of people were the anti-slavery activists, the people that did not want to have slavery, especially the abolitionists who thought it was morally wrong. Then you had these people that used to be in the Whig Party. So the Whigs were kind of dying out by that point. They had only ever had a couple of presidential candidates. They had some leverage in the Senate, mostly Henry Clay, but they were never really a very dominant party like the Democrats were. So you have some people that move away from the Whigs, and they start to join this new party. You also have people that used to be in something called the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party was all about having just basically their whole point was not expanding slavery, like not getting rid of slavery, but just not letting it expand. And also a lot of Northern Democrats were part of that party as well, so they started to join as well. You had some Know Nothing members, which we'll talk about the Know Nothing Party if you really want to know, but they're basically this anti-immigrant party that was around as like a third party. And then people that just want to modernize the country in general with things like the American system. So it's not just about slavery, but anti-slavery activists are finding common ground in there. And they really, really opposed the Southern Democrats, not so much the Northern Democrat Party, which is starting to, again, become split after 1850, but the Southern Democrats especially. Their first presidential candidate, 1856, was John C. Fremont, and he lost the election, but there's actually a big strategy of support and base of support in the North that's growing. And the strategy, again, the big thing is keep slavery where it is. So not expanding slavery, but not abolishing slavery either. And again, it was mostly Most of their arguments are economic in nature, that it's going to harm white workers to expand slavery. And remind me to tell you about this too, slave power theory. Something I learned about actually pretty recently teaching IB history, but it's kind of cool, but I don't want to go into it right now because I know your time is precious. But slave power, we'll talk about the slave power theory. But again, there's a quote from James Oakes during the times: the federal government would surround the South with free states, free territories, and free waters, building what they called a cordon of freedom around slavery, hemming it in until the system's own internal weaknesses forced the slave states one by one to abandon slavery. So basically, they want to make slavery not profitable anymore, not feasible, and just watch it die out instead of actually coming in and taking away property. So then a couple years later, in 1859, it's not so political. You actually have an act of violence, which I do have another video which makes John Brown sound like he was super hardcore, which I think he kind of was, to be honest. But John Brown was this guy up here. He was an anti-slavery activist who believed that God talked to him and told him that he had to help free the slaves. So he was very active in Kansas when during Bleeding Kansas, he and his sons hacked a bunch of pro-slavery people up to death with broadswords, just like came out and hacked them to death. But he and 20 followers went down to Harper's Ferry. This was in Virginia. And their goal was to take as many guns as they possibly could from the federal government. So it was this armory for the military, and start a slave revolt that would eventually snowball and overthrow the entire slave system. So he thought this was going to work really, really well. Problem was, is a bunch of slaves, not enough slaves got the memo. He had talked to Frederick Douglass. He had talked to Harriet Tubman about being part of this. There wasn't a lot of support. So it's pretty much just him and his followers, and eventually they're put down by a guy that's going to become more important later on. But his name was Robert E. Lee, who becomes the general of the Confederacy. But he and the U.S. Marines are able to surround and defeat him. He's put on trial and hanged. But there's different reactions between the two parts of the country that really start to show the polarization that is really just on the edge at this point. So the North reacts by really applauding Brown's motives. They call him a martyr. So somebody that, if you're not familiar with martyr, there's a lot of religious ideas about martyrs, that they die for this specific cause that's very important to them and that they should be revered. And the South sees the North's reaction and attitudes toward the North devolve into what was sometimes called unreasoning fury, because they say, hey, this guy's a terrorist. He came in here and he was killing people in the South in the name of reducing slavery or leading slave revolts. Excuse me, the federal government had to come in and put him down, and you're going to applaud this guy. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So they're pretty upset, and they also think that this is going to possibly become a more popular thing to do in the South, and are worried about the safety of themselves and their property. So there's all competing perspectives that are going on over this development that occurs in Virginia. This is just a quick thing that we might start with, maybe talk about in class, but what you can also see is the political power that's changing in the country. So if you look by year, if you look at the amount of representatives going from free states versus slave states, I mean, overall, it's increasing as the nation increases, but you can see that you're getting much more representation from free states than you are from slave states. And then you start to see in 1830, or sorry, by 1850, you get, it's equal with the Compromise of 1850. But then as you go on, you start to see the free states also gain in the Senate as well. So you're seeing the South especially start to feel like they're losing their political power. If you look at presidents as well, for a long time, most presidents were slaveholders. But over time, when you get to the 1850s, you start to see more and more presidents that are not slaveholders. So the power of slavery or the slave interests is starting to just naturally go away. And what's happening is that the southern states, the slave states, they want to hold on to that power by any means necessary. And it starts to get more and more extreme as they start to feel their political power be more and more threatened. So that leads to this, the final straw, the last event. In 1860, the Republicans nominate a guy originally from Kentucky, but a senator from Illinois, or actually a representative from Illinois. He had never been in the Senate. He was kind of a little bit of a political outcast by that time, named Abraham Lincoln. And you can see, again, I'm colorblind, but I know from history where this is. But in red, up in the north, you can see pretty easily if you just cut it by the Missouri Compromise line. Almost, you get almost a perfect separation of Republican and Democrat, Southern Democrats voting. So Abraham Lincoln is the Republican nomination. You also have this situation where the Democrats are split between the Southern Democrats and just regular Democrats, I guess Northern Democrats. And then you also have this guy named John Bell who runs in the Constitutional Union Party. And their whole point is, let's keep the Union together. They see it kind of splitting apart, and they say our one big thing is not going to be to focus on slavery. We just want to focus on keeping the country together, and that's all we're going to really focus on. So he's an orange. So as you can see, you have a whole bunch of states that vote third party in this election. Okay, with the Constitutional Union Party. You have one state that goes to the Northern Democrats, and then a whole bunch of Southern Democrats. But all the Northern states, for the most part, go to Lincoln. And he only wins about 40% of the popular vote. So far less than a majority of Americans vote for him, but he gets just enough electoral college votes. He needs 152 at that time. He gets 180 in order to win. So it's a very polarized election, and because of the, well, maybe not because of, but part of the fact that the Democrats split, and then also you have this third party that's relatively successful in winning some states, you do end up having Lincoln win the presidency without getting a single Southern state. Fun fact, a lot of the Southern states, when they printed their presidential ballots for voting, they didn't even put Lincoln on it. So like you couldn't even vote for Lincoln if you wanted to in the South. That's how like dire they feel like this is, with the Republicans being seen as this Northern party that's going to come destroy slavery. So 1860, last straw that they feel, okay, and that is the point where the South starts to openly secede. So you have South Carolina going first, and then you have a number of the other Southern states removing themselves from the Union after that, because they believe that they have completely lost their political power and that there's nowhere to go but the end of slavery at this point. Even though, if you remember, the Republican Party doesn't say they want to abolish slavery, they just want to stop it from expanding. So that's where we're at now. I'm going to start with this probably for a review summary, which is where I like to do a number of causes and then make you pick which one you think is the greatest cause, and then talk about why one of them is not. Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free to go back and kind of overview the video, and otherwise I will answer some questions, because I know that these are, I don't want them to just feel like vocab terms to you. I want you to understand like how they impacted the tension that was going on in the colonies, the states at that time. So thank you for all your hard work, and we will talk in class.